1867. A newly formed Klan chapter dragged Clara Tompkins from the road without a word, binding her hands and hauling her into the woods as their first lesson to the freed people of Tennessee. They believed they'd chosen the perfect victim, alone, unarmed, and far from anyone who could challenge them. By nightfall, they were already arguing over how to display her body, boasting about the fear it would spread across 3 counties. What they didn't know, what none of them even imagined, was that Clara's disappearance would unlock a man they should never have provoked. Because the quiet husband they dismissed as a harmless woodworker had once been trained to dismantle groups exactly like theirs, and within 48 hours of taking his wife, half their riders would vanish, their hideouts would be abandoned, and their leaders would be begging for mercy no one would give. So what did those men do in the forest that turned a simple kidnapping into the beginning of their downfall? And how did Clara Tompkins become the one mistake that destroyed them? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun bled out behind the ridge line, staining the Tennessee sky the color of old bruises. Clara Tompkins stepped onto her front porch, medical bag in hand, and studied the fading light with practiced eyes. Another hour and the darkness would be complete. She'd walked these roads at night before, countless times, but lately the air felt different, heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. "You sure about this?" Her neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, called from across the fence. The older woman's face was pinched with worry. Going out alone after what happened to the Johnsons? Clara adjusted the worn leather strap across her shoulder. "Baby doesn't wait for daylight, Mrs. Fletcher. The Carters sent word their daughter's labor started this morning. First baby always takes time. White folks got their own doctors. Not out here, they don't." Clara's voice stayed gentle, but firm. "And no doctor in town's riding out to a poor farming family at night. You know that." Mrs. Fletcher's mouth tightened into a thin line. She knew. Everyone knew. Since the war ended, the world had shifted in ways that made some people grateful and others angry. Clara helped anyone who needed it, black or white, free or poor, because that was what midwives did. That was what her mama had taught her before yellow fever took her 3 winters back. "Just be careful," Mrs. Fletcher finally said. Clara nodded and started down the dirt path that led toward the main road. Her footsteps were quiet, measured. She'd learned long ago to walk with purpose, but without hurry. Moving too fast drew attention. Moving too slow suggested fear. In 1867 Tennessee, a black woman had to calculate every step. The Carter homestead sat 2 miles northeast, tucked against a stand of pines where the land dipped toward the creek. Clara knew the way by heart. She'd delivered Mrs. Carter's niece last spring, and before that, helped set old Mr. Carter's broken arm when he fell from his barn roof. Good people, hard-working, the kind who didn't care about the color of the hands that helped them when they were hurting. The walk took 40 minutes. By the time Clara reached the small wooden house, full dark had settled over the valley. Lamplight glowed warm through the windows. She could hear a woman's low moan even from the yard. Mr. Carter met her at the door, hat in hands, face gray with worry. "Thank God you came, Miss Clara. She's been laboring since dawn. My wife's with her, but—" He gestured helplessly toward the back room. "Let me see her," Clara said simply. The work consumed the next hours. Clara moved through the familiar ritual with steady hands, checking the mother's progress, speaking calm words, preparing clean cloths and boiled water. The young Mrs. Carter, barely 19, just a girl herself, gripped Clara's hand through the contractions, whimpering apologies for squeezing so hard. "You squeeze all you need to," Clara murmured. "Your body's doing exactly what it should." The baby came just after midnight. A boy. Healthy lungs, Good color, strong heartbeat. Clara cleaned him carefully, wrapped him in the blanket Mrs. Carter Sr. had been warming by the fire, and placed him in his mother's arms. The young woman's tears came then, relief and joy and exhaustion all mixed together. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Miss Clara." "You did all the hard work," Clara said, already cleaning her instruments and packing them away. "You rest now. I'll check on you tomorrow." Mr. Carter pressed $2 silver into her palm at the door, more than she usually charged, but she didn't refuse. Times were hard for everyone. The night air felt cool against her skin after the warmth of the birthing room. Clara started back the way she'd come, following the tree line where the walking was easier. The moon was up now, bright enough to see by. Her bag felt lighter somehow. It always did after a successful delivery. New life in the world, hope continuing despite everything. She was halfway home when the feeling came. Clara had learned to trust her instincts. Something whispered at the edge of her awareness, the sense of being watched. She slowed her pace, listening. The woods were too quiet. No crickets, no nightbirds, just the sound of her own breathing. Then hoofbeats, fast and deliberate. Clara turned. 3 riders emerged from the darkness between the trees. They wore white hoods that covered their faces, crude cloth sewn with ragged stitches. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Evening," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" They didn't answer. The horses circled her like wolves around prey. The middle rider spoke. His voice was young, maybe 20. "You, Clara Tompkins? The midwife?" "Yes, sir." "I just delivered—" "We know what you did." The words came out sharp. "Putting your hands on white women, thinking you're some kind of doctor." Clara's mind raced. She recognized that voice, the slight lisp on the "oh yes" sounds. "I helped your sister," she said quietly. "Last year, when her baby was breech. You remember that?" The rider flinched. For a moment she thought she'd reached him. Then the rider on the left spoke, older, harder. "Shut your mouth! We didn't come here to talk." They moved fast. Rough hands grabbed her arms, yanked her toward one of the horses. Clara tried to pull away, but there were too many of them, too strong. Her medical bag fell to the ground, instruments scattering across the dirt. "Please," she said. "Whatever this is about, we can—" A gloved hand clamped over her mouth. She tasted leather and salt. They lifted her, threw her across a saddle. The world spun. A wagon rattled out from the tree line, pulled by a 4th man she hadn't seen. They dragged her into the bed, throwing her down hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. Before they could bind her completely, Clara's fingers found the small surgical blade she kept in her bag's inside pocket. She'd grabbed it by instinct when they first seized her. Now she slid it carefully into her sleeve, pressing it against her forearm. Rough rope bit into her wrists as they tied her hands, too tight. The circulation would cut off soon, but they hadn't found the blade. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding over roots and stones. Torchlight flickered orange across the pine branches overhead, casting wild shadows that danced like demons. Clara could smell burning pitch and horse sweat and her own fear. They were taking her deeper into the forest, away from the road, away from witnesses, away from anyone who might help. Isaiah Tompkins woke to the sound of nothing. That was what caught his attention first. Not the empty space beside him. Clara sometimes rose before dawn to prepare for early births, but the absolute silence of the cabin. No fire crackling to life in the hearth. No soft humming as she moved about the kitchen. No rustle of her skirts, or the gentle clink of the kettle being filled. He opened his eyes. The quilt on her side of the bed lay smooth and undisturbed. The pillow held no impression. Isaiah sat up slowly, his movements measured and deliberate. He was a tall man, lean from years of physical work, with calloused hands that shaped wood into furniture The white merchants in town reluctantly admitted was finer than anything they could import. His face was unremarkable, the kind that blended into crowds, that people looked past without thinking. He'd learned long ago that being forgettable was its own kind of advantage. He dressed in the dim light of early morning. Shirt, trousers, suspenders. His fingers worked the buttons with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no hurry. But his mind was already calculating, sorting through possibilities with the cold precision of a man trained to think 3 moves ahead. Clara had been called to the Carters yesterday evening. First baby. Those usually took time. But all night? Through until dawn? Something wasn't right. Isaiah stepped out onto the porch. The sun was just beginning to break over the eastern ridge, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale gold. The air smelled of pine sap and morning dew. A few early risers moved about their cabins down the road, smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sound of a rooster crowing. Mrs. Fletcher was already up, hanging washing on a line stretched between 2 posts. She looked up when she saw him, and her face changed, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "Morning, Isaiah," she called. Her voice was too careful. He walked over, his boots making soft sounds on the packed earth. "Morning, Mrs. Fletcher. Did you see Clara come back last night?" The older woman's hands stilled on the wet shirt she'd been pinning. "No. I saw her leave around sunset, heading to the Carters. But you didn't see her return. I went to bed around 9. She wasn't back by then." Mrs. Fletcher's mouth pressed into a worried line. "You don't think?" "I'm sure she's fine," Isaiah said. His voice stayed level, reassuring. Probably just stayed to help with the recovery. "You know how she is." But he didn't believe it. And from the look in Mrs. Fletcher's eyes, neither did she. Isaiah walked the 2 miles to the Carter homestead. The morning was warming, birds calling from the trees. He passed other black families working their small plots of land, freedmen trying to build lives from nothing but hope and hard labor. They nodded to him. He nodded back. Everyone knew Isaiah Tompkins, the quiet woodworker, the church deacon who never raised his voice, the man who fixed things without complaint and asked for little in return. No one knew who he'd been before. The Carter house looked peaceful in the morning light. Smoke curled from the chimney. Isaiah knocked on the door, keeping his posture relaxed, unthreatening. Mrs. Carter answered. The older woman, not the daughter. Her face went pale when she saw him. "Mr. Tompkins." She didn't meet his eyes. How can I help you?" "Looking for my wife," Isaiah said. "She came by last night to help with the delivery." Yes, she did." Mrs. Carter's hands twisted in her apron. "The baby came around midnight. Healthy boy. Clara did wonderful work. And then? She left. Maybe midnight. We offered to let her stay until morning, but she said she knew the way home just fine." The words tumbled out too fast. Guilty words. Mr. Carter offered to walk her, but she said no. She didn't want to leave my daughter alone so soon after the birth. Isaiah watched her face. Read the truth there. "You should have insisted." "I know." "Mrs." Carter's voice cracked. "I know. I'm sorry. With everything that's been happening lately, the tensions, we should have—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "She's not home?" "No, ma'am, she's not." Isaiah didn't wait for more apologies. He turned and walked back down the path, his mind already shifting into old patterns. Calculate, assess, track. He moved slowly along the route Clara would have taken, eyes scanning the ground. Most people wouldn't see anything, just dirt and grass and the occasional hoof print from passing horses. But Isaiah had been trained to read landscapes like other men read books. There, 15 yards from the Carter property line. Disturbed earth where horses had stood still for several minutes. The prints were deep. Weighted riders. 3 of them. Circling pattern. Predator movements. He walked further. Found more signs. A struggle. Boot prints. Something heavy dragged. Then he saw it. A small square of fabric caught on a low bush. Clara's kerchief. The one she always kept in her apron pocket. Yellow cotton with tiny blue flowers she'd stitched herself. Isaiah picked it up. The cloth was still slightly damp from night dew. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. The prince led deeper into the woods, away from the road, away from help. He stood there for a long moment, completely still. A man making a decision he knew couldn't be unmade. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. The wooden chest sat at the foot of their bed. Most people in the community thought it held keepsakes from Isaiah's time with the Union Army. Medals, maybe, or letters from fellow soldiers. Clara knew better than to ask what it really contained. That was part of their unspoken agreement. The war was over. The man he'd been then was buried. Isaiah knelt and opened the chest. No medals, no letters. Blades lay wrapped in oiled cloth. Short ones for close work. A longer knife with notches carved along the grip. Each mark representing something he tried not to remember. Maps, yellowed and creased, showing guerrilla routes through Tennessee and Kentucky. Coded papers with instructions written in cipher. A small leather journal filled with names and locations and methods. Tools of infiltration. Tools of elimination. The Union hadn't just needed soldiers. They'd needed men who could move unseen through enemy territory. Men who could dismantle insurgent cells from within. Men who could do the work that regular troops couldn't. The quiet, invisible work that happened in darkness and was never discussed in official reports. Isaiah had been very good at that work. He'd promised himself after Appomattox that he was done. No more killing. No more becoming the monster the war demanded. He'd found Clara in Memphis, married her, moved to this small Tennessee valley to build furniture and sing hymns and live like a normal man. But normal men's wives didn't get taken by hooded riders in the night. Isaiah selected a blade, medium length, balanced for throwing or close combat. He took one of the maps, studying the terrain features he'd memorized years ago. The forests hadn't changed. The hiding places were still there. He closed the chest and stood. The sun was fully up now, bright and clean. Birds sang. Somewhere down the road, children laughed. The world continued like nothing was wrong. Isaiah stepped outside and locked the cabin door behind him. The blade rested against his spine, hidden beneath his shirt. The map was folded in his pocket next to Clara's kerchief. He walked toward the tree line where the prince led. His footsteps were quiet, measured. Anyone watching would see a worried husband searching for his missing wife. They wouldn't see the man underneath. The one who'd spent 3 years learning how to hunt humans. The one who understood violence as a language, who could read intent in a footprint, and death in a broken branch. That man had been sleeping. Now he was awake. Clara woke to rough bark pressing into her spine. Her head pounded. Her mouth tasted like dirt and blood. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory came flooding back. The ambush on the road. Hands dragging her. The wagon ride into darkness. She opened her eyes slowly, trying not to move. Dawn light filtered through pine branches overhead. Her wrists were bound behind her, tied to a tree trunk. Her ankles were lashed together with the same coarse rope. Every muscle in her body ached from hours spent in this position. The camp around her was small and temporary. No permanent structures, just bedrolls scattered around a dead fire pit. 5 men sat or stood nearby, some still wearing their white hoods pulled back like grotesque cowls. Others had removed their disguises entirely, confident she'd never live to identify them. Clara recognized one face, Thomas Whitley, the blacksmith's son. She'd delivered his sister's baby 3 years ago. The woman had nearly died from bleeding, but Clara had saved her. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes now. "We should have done it last night," one man was saying. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard shot through with gray. "Quick and clean. Now we got to worry about folks noticing she's gone." Mr. Barrow's orders were specific. This from a thin man wearing spectacles that caught the morning light. He wants this done right, public, so the whole colored community sees what happens when they forget their place. Clara's breath caught. Mr. Barrow. She knew that name. Everyone did. He owned half the farmland in the county and rented it out to sharecroppers at rates that kept them perpetually in debt. He'd been vocal about opposing Reconstruction, about the natural order being disturbed by freed slaves getting ideas above their station. Public means bringing her back toward town, Beard said. Means more risk, more witnesses. Witnesses is the point. Spectacles stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. We hang her from the old oak at the crossroads, leave her there with a sign. Send a message that treating white folks like equals ain't acceptable. Mr. Barrow's been clear. We need to make examples now, before the election. Show these coloreds that voting rights don't mean they're safe. Thomas Whitley shifted uncomfortably. She's a midwife. She helps people. My sister. Your sister made a mistake asking for help from an woman, Beard interrupted. That's exactly the kind of thinking we're trying to correct. Clara's fingers had been working slowly behind her back, testing the rope. When they'd first tied her, she'd kept her wrists slightly apart, creating tension. Now, in the hours since, the rope had loosened just a fraction. Not much, but enough. The medical blade was still tucked in the inner pocket of her skirt, pressed against her thigh. They'd searched her bag but hadn't thought to check her clothing thoroughly. Men rarely did. They saw a woman's dress as just fabric, not potential concealment. She twisted her wrist carefully, grinding the rope against the bark. The movement was tiny, invisible to anyone not watching closely. The men were too busy arguing. When's Mr. Barrow want this done? Another man spoke up, younger, nervous. He coming out here himself? Course not. Spectacles laughed. He don't dirty his hands with this work. That's what we're for. He organizes, provides the funds and direction. We execute. He paused, seeming to enjoy the double meaning. Tonight, after dark, we'll take her to the crossroads, do it proper with torches and ceremony. Let word spread. And after? Beard asked. Once she's dealt with? Then we move to the real work. Mr. Barrow's got a list. 3 colored settlements within 10 miles. We hit them all the same night, next Saturday. Burn the churches. Run them off their land. Make it clear that Reconstruction or no, this is still a white county. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. 3 settlements. Dozens of families. Children. She kept working at the rope. Her fingers found the blade's handle through the fabric of her skirt. Carefully, using just the pressure of her bound hands, she began maneuvering it upward. The movement was agonizingly slow. Sweat ran down her back, despite the morning chill. I need to take a piss. Beard stood and walked toward the tree line. Me too. The nervous young man followed. That left 3 men in camp, Spectacles, Thomas, and an older man who'd been silent through the whole discussion. 3 conscious armed men between Clara and freedom. The blade handle pressed against her palm now. She could just barely grip it. She angled the edge toward the rope and began sawing with tiny, patient movements. The rope was thick hemp, hard to cut, but the blade was sharp. She'd honed it herself for precise medical work. Cut. Breathe. Cut. Breathe. I don't like this. Thomas spoke quietly. Mr. Barrow or no, killing a woman feels wrong. You getting soft? Spectacles turned on him. Your family's land is mortgaged to Barrow. You want him calling that debt? You want your ma and sisters out on the road? Thomas looked away. No, I just... Then you do what you're told. We all do. That's how this works. A strand of rope separated, then another. Clara felt the binding loosen fractionally. She kept cutting, her wrist screaming from the awkward angle. Something's different about tonight, though. The older man finally spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel dragged across wood. Weather's changing. Storm coming in from the west. You want to do a hanging in the rain? Spectacles frowned, looking at the sky. We'll manage. Might be smarter to wait until... Shouting erupted from the tree line. Clara's head snapped up. Beard and the nervous young man were fighting, grappling with each other near the edge of camp. She couldn't make out words, just angry voices and the sounds of fists hitting flesh. All three remaining men rushed toward the fight. The rope broke. Clara's hands came free. She yanked the blade fully out of her pocket and slashed the binding around her ankles. The circulation rushed back into her feet with painful intensity. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. She had seconds, maybe less. Clara lunged to her feet and ran into the forest opposite the fighting men. Branches whipped at her face. Thorns caught at her dress, tearing the fabric. She didn't care. She ran. Behind her, someone shouted, "She's loose! The woman's running!" Footsteps crashed through undergrowth. Clara's legs burned. Her feet, numb from being bound, stumbled over roots and stones. She caught herself on a tree trunk, kept moving. The forest was dense here, thick with underbrush and fallen logs. It slowed her pursuers, but slowed her too. Her wrist throbbed where the rope had cut into skin. Blood ran warm and slick down her palm. She pressed the wound against her dress, applying pressure while she ran. In her mind, she catalogued the injury. Superficial laceration, no severed tendons, manageable bleeding. Her midwife training took over even in flight. She could hear them behind her, crashing through brush like hounds, multiple voices calling to each other, coordinating. They knew these woods better than she did. They had horses nearby. But Clara had delivered babies in cabins miles from any road. She'd walked through forests at night, carrying nothing but a lantern and her bag. She knew how to move through darkness, how to read terrain by feel. The sun climbed higher. The day grew hot. Clara's dress was soaked with sweat and blood and mud. She found a stream, shallow and cold, and waded through it for 20 yards before emerging on the opposite bank. It might confuse dogs if they brought them, might buy her time. She heard horses then, distant but getting closer. The jingle of tack, men's voices carrying through the trees. Spread out, search in grid pattern. Can't have gotten far on foot. Barrow wants her found before... Clara ducked beneath a fallen tree, pressing herself into the hollow beneath its trunk. She wrapped her bleeding wrist in a torn piece of her petticoat, binding it tight. The fabric immediately soaked through, but the pressure would slow the bleeding. She needed her strength. The riders passed within 30 yards of her hiding spot. She counted 5 horses, saw white hoods bobbing between trees. 3 more settlements, one rider called. That's the plan. Saturday night. We need her dead before then, so the coloreds know we mean business. They moved on. The sounds faded. Clara stayed hidden, breathing slowly, listening to the forest. Evening shadows were lengthening now, the light turning golden between the branches. She'd been running all day. Her body screamed for rest, for water, for safety. A horn sounded in the distance, long and low, like a hunting call. Then another horn answered from a different direction. They were organizing, surrounding the forest, preparing for a thorough search. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember every prayer her mother had taught her. Isaiah entered the forest as the first light broke through the canopy. The ground was still damp with dew, making the tracks easier to read. He moved without hurry, his eyes scanning the earth in methodical sweeps. Every broken twig told a story. Every disturbed patch of soil held information. The hoofprints were fresh, maybe 12 hours old. 5 horses, moving in loose formation. The riders had been careless, letting their mounts trample undergrowth and leave deep impressions in the soft earth. These were not experienced trackers. They were enthusiasts, eager but clumsy. But someone had organized them. Someone had given them direction. Isaiah knelt beside a set of boot prints pressed deep into mud near a fallen log. The pattern was military issue, common surplus from the war. He'd seen similar prints in Tennessee and Georgia during his covert work. Young men who bought army boots from depot sales, wearing them like badges of service they'd never actually earned. He moved forward, following the trail deeper into the forest. The morning air was thick with humidity. Insects buzzed around his head. Isaiah ignored them, his focus absolute. He noted where horses had paused, where riders had dismounted. One set of tracks showed hesitation, the boots pacing back and forth near a tree. An argument, perhaps. Disagreement among the group. That was useful. Division meant weakness. By mid-morning, he found where Clara had been tied. The rope fibers were still tangled around the tree trunk, cut cleanly with something sharp. Isaiah picked up a strand and examined it. Hemp, standard thickness, probably purchased in bulk. He tucked the fiber into his pocket. Blood marked the bark where she'd leaned. Not much, a smear about the size of his palm. Isaiah touched it with one finger, felt the stickiness not yet fully dried. She'd been here at dawn, maybe earlier, working at her bonds while the men argued. He could picture her doing it. Patient. Methodical. Clara approached everything that way, whether delivering babies or mending wounds or cutting herself free from men who meant to kill her. The thought of her tied to this tree, frightened and hurting, made something cold settle in Isaiah's chest. He pushed the feeling down. Emotion clouded judgment. He needed clarity. The trail split. Boot prints scattered in multiple directions, the men searching after she'd escaped. But Isaiah found Clara's tracks separate from the chaos. Bare feet. Running. She'd lost her shoes or kicked them off for speed. The prints were light, quick, showing she'd moved with purpose despite the terrain. He followed her path. At midday, Isaiah made camp in a small clearing screened by dense undergrowth. He couldn't risk a fire large enough to be seen, so he built a tiny coal bed, barely smoking. From his pack, he removed dried venison and hardtack, eating slowly while his mind worked through the patterns he'd observed. The clan riders were organized by someone with tactical sense. The grid search pattern they'd attempted showed planning, even if the execution was poor. The timing of the attack, taking Clara during a nighttime call, showed patience and forethought. And the mention of settlements, of coordinated violence, suggested resources beyond what a handful of angry young men could muster alone. Someone was funding this, someone with property, influence, connections. Isaiah chewed the tough meat and considered possibilities. He'd need more information, names, locations, the structure of command. But first, he needed to find Clara alive. He packed his gear and continued tracking. The afternoon heat pressed down through the canopy. Isaiah's shirt clung to his back with sweat. He moved in silence, placing each foot carefully, avoiding dry branches and loose stones. Old instincts guided him, the same instincts that had kept him alive during night raids on Confederate supply lines, during infiltrations of guerrilla camps where discovery meant torture and death. He'd buried that part of himself after Appomattox, tried to become the man Clara deserved, gentle, patient, present. A woodworker who measured carefully and built things meant to last. A deacon who spoke softly and listened more than he talked. But that man couldn't save her. That man wasn't equipped for what was coming. Isaiah found the torn fabric snagged on a low branch near a stream crossing. The cloth was from Clara's dress, a piece about the size of his hand. Dark blue cotton, worn soft from washing. He held it up to the light, saw the clean tear where thorns had caught it. She'd crossed the stream here. Smart. It would confuse dogs if they brought them. Blood marked the torn edge, fresh enough to still be damp. Isaiah's jaw tightened. She was hurt, running, alone in woods full of men hunting her. He scanned the opposite bank, found where she'd climbed out. Her tracks continued east, toward higher ground. He followed. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when Isaiah discovered their temporary camp. The fire pit was cold but recent, maybe 6 hours old. Rope fragments lay scattered around a tree. Discarded cloth, probably used to gag her, was trampled into the dirt. He circled the area slowly, reading the story written in disturbed earth and crushed grass. 5 men had camped here. They'd argued. Scuff marks showed where 2 had fought. Clara had run during the distraction, heading northeast. The men had pursued on horseback, spreading out in multiple directions. Movement caught Isaiah's eye. He dropped low, pressing himself against a fallen log. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards distant, masked riders were gathering. He counted 7 horses now. They'd called in reinforcements. The men dismounted in a clearing, pulling off their hoods to wipe sweat from their faces. Isaiah couldn't hear their words from this distance, but he could see their gestures. One man, older, wearing spectacles, seemed to be giving orders. He pointed in different directions, dividing the group. Another man unfolded a map, spreading it across a horse's saddle. They were planning a sweep, coordinated, thorough. The light was failing fast now. Within an hour, it would be full dark. Perfect cover for a night search. Isaiah withdrew silently, moving upslope toward a rocky outcrop he'd noticed earlier. Higher ground meant better visibility. It meant seeing their formation, understanding their strategy. He climbed carefully, using roots and stone handholds, making no sound. The outcrop rose maybe 40 feet above the forest floor, crowned with weathered boulders that provided natural cover. From this vantage point, he could see the clearing below. The riders were mounting up again, spreading into a line. They lit torches as darkness gathered. 7 flames flickered between the trees, moving in coordinated sweeps. Isaiah settled into position between 2 boulders, invisible from below. He watched the pattern of their search, memorized the spacing between riders, noted which men seemed confident and which were nervous. One rider hung back from the others, reluctant, young from his posture. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if wanting to leave. Another potential weakness, another thread to pull. The horns sounded again, closer now. Long, mournful notes echoing through the forest. The riders answered with calls of their own, coordinating positions. Isaiah counted the intervals between signals, measured the distances, built a map in his mind of their formation and movement. Below, the torches swept through darkness like hunting spirits. Above, Isaiah watched in perfect stillness, learning everything he needed to know. Clara's legs trembled with each step. The forest had given way to cleared land, fields lying fallow in the fading light. She'd been moving for hours, rationing her strength, pausing whenever she heard voices or hoofbeats in the distance. Her wrist throbbed where the rope had torn skin. The makeshift bandage she'd fashioned from her petticoat was soaked through with blood and dirt. Every breath came shallow and quick. Her bare feet were cut and blistered, leaving dark prints on the dry grass. Ahead, a structure emerged from the gloom, old, weathered. A smokehouse, probably abandoned based on the sagging roof and missing boards. Clara stumbled toward it, driven by pure need. She had to rest. Had to stop moving before her body simply gave out. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. She pushed it open, wincing at the creak. Inside smelled of old ash and cured meat, though the hooks hung empty now. Burlap sacks were piled in one corner. A broken barrel lay on its side. Clara collapsed onto the sacks, pulling her knees to her chest. The shaking wouldn't stop. Shock, probably. Blood loss. Exhaustion. She pressed her injured wrist against her body, trying to slow the bleeding through pressure alone. Just a few minutes, she told herself. Just enough to catch her breath. Outside, footsteps approached across packed earth. Clara's eyes snapped open. She'd dozed without meaning to, her body surrendering to fatigue. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. A shadow blocked the thin light seeping through cracks in the walls. The door opened slowly. A young white man stood in the entrance, maybe 20 years old, holding a lantern in one hand. His other hand rested on a knife at his belt. He wore simple farmer's clothes, worn trousers, a patched shirt, suspenders. His face was lean and sunburned, with pale eyes that widened when they found her. "Clara!" The word came out barely above a whisper. She recognized him then. Amos Whitfield. His sister Sarah had nearly died 2 years back, bleeding too much after a difficult birth. Clara had spent 3 days at their cabin, sleeping on the floor between rounds of checking Sarah's vitals, changing dressings, brewing teas that helped clot the blood. Sarah had lived. The baby had lived. Amos had cried when Clara finally said they were safe. Now he stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the knife. His jaw worked like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. Behind him, the evening sky was darkening toward full night. "Please," Clara said. Her voice cracked from thirst. "Please don't tell them." Amos glanced over his shoulder, scanning the empty field. When he looked back, his face was twisted with something between fear and shame. "They're hunting you," he said quietly. "The whole cell. Mr. Barrow put out orders that whoever finds you gets—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Gets what?" Clara kept her eyes steady on his face. "A reward? For killing a woman who saved your sister's life?" The words hit him like a slap. His hand fell away from the knife. "I didn't want—" He swallowed hard. "I didn't know they were taking you. When they told us what happened, I thought maybe you'd already gotten away. I was hoping—" "You were hoping someone else would find me," Clara finished, "so you wouldn't have to choose." Amos's shoulders sagged. He set the lantern down and pushed the door closed behind him, shutting out the last of the daylight. The small flame cast jumping shadows across the walls. "I'll get you water," he said finally, "and something to eat. But you can't stay long. If they find you here, they'll burn my family's farm." He disappeared before Clara could respond. She heard his footsteps retreating across the yard, then silence. Minutes passed. She used the time to examine her wrist more carefully. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound needed proper cleaning. Without that, infection would set in within days. Amos returned carrying a clay jug and a cloth bundle. He knelt beside her, keeping careful distance, and set both items down. The jug sloshed with water. The bundle held stale bread and a piece of hard cheese. "Thank you," Clara said. She drank deeply, not caring that water spilled down her chin. The bread was tough enough to hurt her jaw, but she ate it anyway, forcing her body to accept fuel. Amos watched her in silence. Then he noticed her wrist. "That needs tending," he said. "You have anything in that bag of yours?" Clara looked at him. "They took my bag when they grabbed me." "Right." Amos stood and moved to the corner, rummaging through a wooden crate. He came back with a mostly clean rag and a small tin of salve. "My pa keeps supplies out here for when he slaughters hogs. This should help." He unwrapped her makeshift bandage with surprising gentleness. His hands were rough from farm work, but steady. He cleaned the wound with water from the jug, applied the salve, and bound it with the fresh rag. The whole time, he didn't meet her eyes. "Your sister," Clara said softly. "How is she?" "Good." A ghost of a smile crossed Amos's face. "The baby's walking now. Sarah named her Clara, after you. We call her Little Clara." The name hung between them, a reminder of debt and connection. "Then why are you with them?" Clara asked. "Why are you riding with men who would kill someone your family honored?" Amos's hands stilled. He sat back on his heels, staring at the dirt floor. "I don't know," he said finally. "My cousins joined first, said it was about protecting what we had, about keeping things from changing too fast. They made it sound like we were defending something good." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. "I didn't know they'd start hurting people. Taking folks." planning worse. And now that you know? Now I'm in too deep to get out without them coming after me, too. Clara reached out with her uninjured hand and touched his arm. He flinched, but didn't pull away. It's not too deep, she said. Not yet. But if you stay with them, if you let their violence become your violence, it will be. You'll cross a line you can't come back from. Amos's throat worked. What am I supposed to do? Help me get away. Then leave yourself. Take your family and go somewhere. The clan doesn't have its hooks in you. Before he could answer, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Multiple riders moving fast. Amos scrambled to his feet and doused the lantern. Darkness swallowed the smokehouse. Stay quiet, he whispered. Don't move. He slipped outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. Clara pressed herself flat against the burlap sacks, controlling her breathing, making herself small. Through gaps in the boards, she saw torchlight sweep across the yard. 3 riders circled the property. One of them called out, "Amos! You seen any tracks around here?" "No, sir." Amos's voice came from somewhere near the main house. "Been working the backfield all day. Ain't seen nothing unusual." "You sure?" "Barrow says she's headed this direction." "I'm sure. If she came through here, I'd have noticed." A long pause. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "All right, then," the rider said finally. "You see anything? You sound the horn." "We're sweeping east toward the ridge." "Yes, sir." The horses moved off, their hoofbeats gradually fading. Clara waited, counting her breaths, until Amos returned. He didn't open the door. Instead, he pressed close to the wall, speaking through the boards. "That was close," he said quietly. "They're pushing the search wider. By morning, they'll have covered every property within 5 miles. Then I need to move tonight." "No, you're too weak. I can see it." Amos was quiet for a moment. "Rest now. Get your strength back. Before dawn, I'll move you. There's an old root cellar on the abandoned Peterson place, about 2 miles north. Nobody goes there anymore. You can hide while I figure out how to get you somewhere safe." Clara wanted to argue, to say she couldn't risk trusting him, but her body was already failing. She could barely keep her eyes open, and Amos had lied for her once already, putting himself in danger. "All right," she whispered. "Before dawn." "Before dawn," Amos confirmed. "I promise." His footsteps retreated toward the main house. Clara settled back onto the burlap sacks, pulling one over herself like a blanket. The coarse fabric scratched her skin, but it was something. Protection, however thin. She closed her eyes and tried to rest. What neither she nor Amos knew was that one of the riders had lingered behind. He dismounted quietly, circling back on foot to watch the Whitfield property from the tree line. He'd seen Amos standing too close to the smokehouse, speaking to the walls like a man talking to someone hidden inside. The rider smiled beneath his hood and turned his horse back toward the main camp. Isaiah waited until full darkness settled over the forest before he moved. The torchlight from the barn below had been visible for an hour, flickering through gaps in the wooden walls like a contained fire. Men on horseback had been arriving steadily, their voices carrying up through the trees in harsh bursts of laughter and angry muttering. He counted 17 riders so far, more than he'd expected. Isaiah descended from his vantage point with practiced silence, placing each footfall on solid ground, avoiding dry leaves and brittle twigs. His boots were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. His breathing stayed shallow and controlled. These were skills the Union had drilled into him until they became reflex, until moving unseen felt more natural than walking openly. The memory of those training camps rose unbidden, the instructors who taught him to kill quietly, the missions into Confederate-held territory, where discovery meant torture and death. He'd buried that part of himself when the war ended, tried to become someone Clara could love without reservation. But Clara needed the man he'd been, not the man he'd pretended to be. At the base of the hill, Isaiah paused behind a cluster of thick pines. From here he could see the barn clearly. It stood alone in a wide clearing, probably chosen for its isolation. Smart. No nearby houses meant no witnesses to whatever planning happened inside. Two guards flanked the main entrance, both holding rifles loosely across their chests. They wore white hoods that covered their faces completely, with crude eye holes cut into the fabric. The hoods looked new, the white cloth still crisp. Someone had money behind this operation. Money for uniforms, for weapons, for organization. Isaiah needed one of those hoods. He circled wide around the clearing, staying in the tree line, watching for stragglers. 10 minutes passed before he found what he needed. A lone rider dismounting near a smaller shed, away from the main gathering. The man tied his horse to a post and walked toward the barn, adjusting his hood as he went. Isaiah moved fast. He closed the distance in seconds, coming up behind the rider as the man reached for the shed door. One hand clamped over the mouth. The other struck precisely at the base of the skull. Not hard enough to kill, just enough to drop consciousness like snuffing a candle. The man crumpled without a sound. Isaiah dragged him into the shed, working quickly. He stripped off the hood and robe, checked the man's breathing to ensure he'd wake eventually, then bound and gagged him with rope from the wall. The whole process took less than a minute. Isaiah pulled the hood over his head. The fabric smelled like sweat and tobacco. The eye holes didn't align perfectly with his vision, forcing him to tilt his head slightly to see clearly. The robe hung loose on his frame, but covered him well enough. He walked toward the barn with steady confidence, neither too fast nor too slow. The guards at the door barely glanced at him as he passed through. Inside, the heat from packed bodies hit him immediately. At least 30 men crowded the space, some standing, others sitting on hay bales or leaning against support beams. More than he'd counted from the hill. Torches mounted on the walls cast jumping shadows. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed men and horses. Isaiah positioned himself near the back wall, between two other hooded figures who paid him no attention. At the front of the barn, a man stood on a raised platform made of stacked crates. He wore no hood. His face was pale and clean-shaven, his clothing expensive, tailored suit, polished boots. This had to be Barrow, the landowner funding this operation. "Gentlemen," Barrow said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "we gather tonight to reclaim what was stolen from us." The crowd muttered approval. Someone shouted agreement. "Tomorrow evening," Barrow continued, "we strike at the heart of their insolence. 4 settlements, 4 fires, all burning simultaneously to show that white men still rule this land." Isaiah's hands clenched beneath the robe. 4 settlements. That meant dozens of families, maybe hundreds of people. Women and children would be inside those homes when the fires started. Barrow gestured to a crude map pinned to the wall behind him. "The largest settlement is here, along Timber Creek. That's where we'll focus primary force. The others are smaller, easier targets. We'll divide into 4 groups, each taking one location. Strike fast, burn everything, and be gone before any federal troops can respond." A man near the front raised his hand. "What about resistance? Some of them freedmen got guns now." "Let them resist," Barrow said with a cold smile. "Any man who stands against us proves why this action is necessary. We're not murderers. We're defenders of civilization. If they force our hand, their blood is on them, not us." The logic twisted Isaiah's stomach. These men actually believed they were righteous. Barrow continued outlining the plan. Isaiah memorized everything: the timing of the attacks, the routes each group would take, where weapons were being stored, how they planned to retreat if confronted. He studied the men around him, noting which ones seemed nervous, which ones eager, which ones drunk enough to be unreliable. Near the platform, several rifles leaned against the wall. Boxes that probably held more ammunition sat stacked beside them. The clan was treating this like a military operation, complete with supply lines and tactical coordination. Isaiah was mentally mapping his exit route when a voice spoke directly beside him. "You're tall." Isaiah turned slowly. A shorter man in a hood stood too close, his head tilted back to look up at Isaiah's face through the eye holes. "I don't recognize your height," the man continued. His tone carried suspicion. "Who brought you in?" Isaiah's mind raced. He kept his voice low and rough, matching the cadence of the men around him. "Came with the Shelby County boys. We got 3 new recruits this week." "Shelby County?" The man considered this. "You know Thomas Garrett?" "Know of him. Ain't met personally." The man stepped even closer. Isaiah could smell whiskey on his breath. "Funny. Because I rode with the Shelby group tonight, and I don't recall seeing nobody your size." Other heads were turning now, attention shifting toward them. Isaiah needed to deflect fast. He leaned down, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "You calling me a liar? You want to make a scene in front of Barrow over some pissing contest about who knows who?" The implied threat worked. The man hesitated, clearly unwilling to disrupt the meeting over a hunch. After a long pause, he grunted and turned away. But Isaiah saw him glance back twice, still suspicious. The meeting continued another 10 minutes. Barrow assigned leaders for each attack group and set the timing. Tomorrow at dusk, when families would be gathering for evening meals. Maximum impact. When the meeting finally broke, Isaiah slipped out with the first wave of departing men. He walked with a cluster toward the horses, then veered away while others were mounting. No one noticed. Outside the barn, he paused long enough to place small markers, 3 stones stacked in a specific pattern, near the tree line at opposite corners of the clearing. Navigation points he could find quickly in darkness or chaos. Then he moved into the woods, pulling off the hood and robe as soon as the trees concealed him. He stuffed them under a fallen log and started back toward higher ground. He was 50 yards into the forest when pain flared in his side. Isaiah pressed his hand against his ribs and felt wetness. Blood. He must have caught himself on something when he'd squeezed past the barn wall to place the second marker. The cut wasn't deep, but it would slow him. He reached a large oak and leaned against it, breathing carefully, applying pressure to the wound. His mind was already working through the impossibility of his situation. Clara was somewhere in these woods, possibly recaptured, possibly dying. And tomorrow evening, 4 communities would burn unless he stopped it. He had less than 24 hours to rescue his wife and dismantle an organized attack force of 30 armed men. Isaiah closed his eyes and let himself feel the weight of it for exactly 10 seconds. Then he opened them again and began moving through the darkness. Amos shook Clara awake before the first birds sang. "We have to go now," he whispered through the gap in the smokehouse boards, "while it's still dark." Clara sat up on the burlap sacks, her whole body aching from sleeping on hard ground. The wrist wound Amos had bandaged throbbed with each heartbeat. She could feel dried blood pulling at the cloth wrapping. "Where?" she asked quietly. "Creek bed, half a mile east. Water will hide your scent if they bring dogs." Amos fumbled with the door latch outside. The rusty hinges groaned as he pulled it open. "I know these woods better than most of them. We can make it." Clara stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cool and damp, heavy with coming rain. She could smell it in the wind, that particular thickness that promised a storm before noon. Amos led her around the back of the smokehouse, away from the main road. He moved with nervous energy, constantly checking over his shoulder, his hands shaking whenever they paused. Clara recognized fear when she saw it. This young man was terrified of what he was doing, but he was doing it anyway. That took a particular kind of courage. They crossed an overgrown field where weeds reached past Clara's knees. The stalks whispered against her dress as she pushed through. Amos stayed 3 steps ahead, following some path only he could see in the darkness. My sister talks about you sometimes, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Says you saved her life when the baby was coming wrong. Says you stayed all night even though my pa couldn't pay nothing. Clara remembered. A breech birth, the girl barely 17, bleeding badly after the delivery. Clara had packed the wound with clean cloth and herbs, stayed until morning to make sure infection didn't set in. The family had given her a basket of apples weeks later, more than payment enough. Your sister is a strong woman, Clara said. She did the hard part. She told me if I ever saw you in trouble, I should help. She made me promise. Amos's voice cracked slightly. I know what we're doing is wrong. I know it. But I got pulled into this group because my cousins were joining, and they said if I didn't come along, they'd think I was sympathizing. And now? Now I know they were wrong about everything. They reached the edge of the field where the ground sloped downward. Clara could hear water running somewhere below. The creek. Amos started down the slope, his boots sliding slightly on loose dirt. Clara followed, using tree trunks to steady herself. The darkness made every step uncertain. Her injured wrist made gripping difficult. They were halfway down the slope when horses nickered in the near distance. Amos froze. No, 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 no! Keep moving, Clara urged, but it was already too late. Two riders emerged from the trees to their left, materializing out of the pre-dawn shadows like ghosts. Both wore white hoods. Both held rifles. Well now, one of them said, his voice muffled by the fabric. Amos Whitfield. Out for a morning walk with our escaped guest. Amos stepped in front of Clara instinctively. Let her go. This ain't right and you know it. What I know, the rider said, dismounting smoothly, is that you're a traitor to your own people. He moved forward with casual confidence. Henry heard you talking to someone last night. Followed you this morning to confirm. The second rider dismounted as well, circling around to cut off their escape route downhill. Amos reached for something at his belt. Maybe a knife, maybe nothing, but he never got the chance to draw it. The first rider swung his rifle butt in a brutal arc that connected with Amos's jaw. The young man dropped instantly, his body crumpling like wet paper. Clara lunged to help him, but hands seized her from behind. The second rider had moved faster than she'd realized. He wrenched her arms back, ignoring her cry of pain when his grip reopened her wrist wound. Thought you were clever, he said against her ear. Thought you could run, but Mr. Barrow wants you alive for the example. You and this traitor both. They dragged Amos to his feet. Blood ran from his split lip, and his eyes struggled to focus. The first rider punched him hard in the stomach, doubling him over. That's for betraying your brothers, the rider said. They threw both Clara and Amos over the backs of the horses like sacks of grain. Clara's ribs pressed painfully against the saddle. She watched the ground pass beneath her as they rode, watched Amos's blood drip into the dirt, watched the creek she'd almost reached disappear behind them. The new holding area was a livestock pen behind an abandoned farmhouse, split-rail fence, mud-packed ground, a feed trough that hadn't been used in years. They chained Clara and Amos to opposite posts using iron shackles that bit into skin. Amos's face was swelling already, one eye nearly shut. He tried to speak, but only managed a wet cough. Save your strength, Clara told him quietly. Around them, more riders were gathering. The sky was lightening toward dawn. Someone was building a fire in the farmhouse yard. Others were checking weapons, preparing for something. They're going to make examples of us, Amos managed to say through his split lip. Kill us in front of everybody. Show what happens to race traitors and uppity-colored. Clara wanted to offer comfort, to tell him everything would be fine. But she couldn't make herself speak lies. Not now. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the truth they both understood. Isaiah found the smokehouse 90 minutes after Clara had been taken from it. The door hung open. The ground outside showed clear signs of struggle. Boot prints, drag marks, drops of blood. He knelt in the dirt, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken grass. 2 horses, 2 riders. They'd come from the west and departed heading northeast, moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing, confident in their capture. Isaiah stood slowly, his wounded side protesting the movement. The gash in his ribs had stopped bleeding, but every breath pulled at tender tissue. He'd need to clean and bind it properly soon, but there wasn't time now. He followed the trail through the field, moving faster than caution recommended. The drag marks were easy to track in the soft ground. Clara had been here recently, within the last hour, maybe less. He was crossing a narrow clearing when movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Isaiah dropped and rolled as a gunshot cracked through the morning air. The bullet struck a tree where his head had been a second earlier. Bark exploded in sharp fragments. 2 men emerged from opposite sides of the clearing, both armed. Scouts, probably left behind to watch for pursuit. The first one fired again while running forward. The shot went wide. Isaiah came up from his roll already moving, closing the distance before the man could aim properly. He struck fast and hard, palm to throat, knee to solar plexus, taking the rifle as the scout collapsed. The second scout was smarter. He'd positioned himself behind a thick oak, using it for cover while he aimed. Isaiah saw the rifle barrel tracking him and threw himself sideways as another shot rang out. The bullet caught his shoulder, not deep, but enough to spin him partially around. Pain bloomed hot and immediate. Isaiah hit the ground and rolled again, coming up behind a fallen log. He could feel blood running down his arm now, joining the blood from his side wound. Too much blood. His body was starting to feel the accumulated damage, the lack of sleep, the constant movement, the injuries stacking up. The second scout was reloading. Isaiah could hear the mechanical click of the rifle mechanism. He had maybe 3 seconds before the man was ready to fire again. He grabbed a rock the size of his fist and threw it hard to the left, making it crash through brush. The scout flinched toward the sound instinctively. In that half-second of distraction, Isaiah moved. He covered the distance in 4 strides, tackling the scout before the man could bring the rifle around. They went down together in a tangle of limbs. The scout was younger, faster, but Isaiah fought with the cold efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. He applied pressure to the carotid artery until the scout went limp. Isaiah stood shakily, pressing his hand against the new shoulder wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing bone, but the damage was done. His left arm was compromised now. Moving it sent fresh waves of pain through his shoulder. He was slowing down, getting weaker. The odds, already terrible, were getting worse. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Isaiah looked up as the first raindrops began to fall, cold and heavy. Within seconds, it became a downpour, washing away the drag marks he'd been following, erasing Clara's trail. He stood in the clearing with rain streaming down his face, blood mixing with water, and allowed himself one moment of something close to despair. Then he forced his feet to move, retreating deeper into the forest to find shelter and treat his wounds before blood loss made decisions for him. In the livestock pen, Clara felt the rain begin. She looked across the mud at Amos, who sat with his back against his post, shaking from cold and fear and pain. His eyes met hers through the downpour. Clara reached out as far as her chains allowed. Amos did the same. Their fingertips barely touched across the space between them, but it was enough. She clasped his trembling hand and held on. Around them, hooded figures moved with purpose in the rain, building something near the center of the yard. A platform, Clara realized, a stage for their symbolic killing. Dawn was breaking through the storm clouds, gray and cold. The clan was preparing to make their example at first light. The rain fell steadily as Isaiah pressed deeper into the forest, searching for shelter. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. Blood had soaked through his shirt, mixing with the rain that ran down his back. He found an overhang of rock, barely wide enough for one man but dry underneath. He crawled beneath it and sat with his back against stone, breathing carefully to manage the pain. For several minutes, he simply sat there, letting his body rest while his mind worked. He'd made mistakes tonight, moving too fast, allowing emotion to cloud judgment, fighting scouts when he should have avoided detection entirely. The old instincts had risen up sharp and familiar, but they'd come with all the rage he'd spent years trying to bury. That rage had made him sloppy, reckless. He couldn't afford recklessness now. Isaiah removed his soaked shirt, biting down against the pain as fabric pulled at the shoulder wound. He examined it carefully in the gray dawn light filtering through rain. The bullet had passed cleanly through the meat of his shoulder, missing major vessels. Painful, but manageable if he treated it properly. From his pack, he withdrew the cloth strips he'd brought, torn from an old sheet. He cleaned both wounds as best he could with rainwater, then began binding them methodically. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, wrapping the shoulder first, then the ribs, pulling the cloth tight enough to compress without restricting breathing. The physical act of treating his wounds helped calm his mind. It was something concrete, practical, something he could control. When he finished binding the injuries, Isaiah sat very still beneath the overhang and forced himself to remember why he'd learned these skills in the first place. Not for revenge, not for destruction, for protection. During the war, the Union had needed men who could move unseen through hostile territory, men who could identify and eliminate specific threats before those threats killed innocent people. Isaiah had been good at it because he understood precision. He understood the difference between necessary action and needless violence. He'd never enjoyed the killing, never taken satisfaction in it. Each elimination had been a calculated decision. This person would cause this harm if not stopped. Therefore, stopping them protected these specific lives. The work had nearly destroyed him anyway. By the war's end, he'd felt hollowed out, barely human. He'd come home to Clara and buried every weapon, every skill, every memory of what he'd done. He'd become a woodworker who attended church and spoke softly and never raised his voice even when angered. He'd thought he could leave that other self behind forever. But now Clara needed the man he'd been. Not the rage-driven killer he feared becoming, but the protective operative who moved with cold clarity, who assessed threats and neutralized them with surgical precision. Isaiah took a slow breath and felt something shift inside him. Not the drowning rage from earlier, but a focused calm. The discipline that had kept him alive through dozens of missions was still there, buried under years of gentleness, but not gone. He could use these skills without losing himself to them. He could protect without becoming the monster he feared. The distinction mattered. Isaiah opened his pack fully and laid out what he'd brought. 2 knives, wire for silent work, flint and steel, a small pouch of black powder he'd saved from the war. He studied each item, constructing a plan that would use terrain, timing, and the clan's own confidence against them. They would be gathered, focused on their prisoners, certain of their strength in numbers. He would use all of that. The rain began to lighten as Isaiah prepared himself mentally for what needed to happen. He visualized the approach, the diversions, the eliminations that would be necessary. Not revenge killing, protective action, removing immediate threats to Clara's life and the community's safety. His shoulder ached. His ribs protested every deep breath. But his hands were steady now, and his mind was clear. Isaiah gathered his tools and crawled out from beneath the overhang. The rain had become a light mist. Dawn was breaking gray and cold through the trees. He moved toward the clan camp with renewed purpose, each step deliberate and quiet. In the livestock pen, Clara held Amos's shaking hand and spoke quietly through the rain. "You tried to help me," she said. "That matters." Whatever happens now, that kindness matters. Amos's swollen face turned toward her. I should have done more. Should have never joined them in the first place. You were scared, confused. They made you think you had to choose sides. Clara squeezed his hand gently. But when it counted, you chose mercy over cruelty. You chose to help instead of harm. Look where it got us, Amos said bitterly. It got you to a place where you can look yourself in the mirror, Clara told him. Can the others say that? Around them, the clan members moved with grim efficiency, building their platform, checking ropes. Someone had brought a large cross, roughly constructed from timber. They were planning something theatrical, Clara realized, something designed to terrify. She thought about Isaiah, about their quiet cabin and the garden they'd planted together last spring, about the way he smiled when she came home from a successful delivery, how he always had hot tea waiting, no matter how late the hour. She thought about all the babies she'd brought into this world, all the mothers she'd helped survive childbirth, all the small kindnesses that made up the fabric of her life. If she died today, that work wouldn't be erased. Those lives would continue. The children she'd delivered would grow up. The mothers would remember her hands steadying them through pain. The thought didn't make death easier to face, but it strengthened something inside her. A refusal to let these men's hatred be the final word on her existence. I forgive you, Clara said to Amos, for whatever guilt you're carrying. I forgive you. Amos made a choked sound that might have been a sob. His hand tightened around hers. The rain stopped. Light broke through the clouds in pale shafts, illuminating the farmhouse yard in cold morning clarity. Clara could see everything now. The platform, the cross, the gathered men in their white hoods, maybe 20 of them. Mr. Barrow stood near the farmhouse, distinguished by his fine boots and watch chain visible beneath the robe. This was it then, the moment they'd been building toward. Clara took a slow breath and prepared herself for whatever came next. Then she heard something, a faint rustling from the tree line to the east. So subtle she almost missed it, beneath the dripping of water from leaves. She looked toward the sound but saw nothing except shadows and branches. Amos heard it too. His head turned slightly, eyes narrowing. The clan members hadn't noticed. They were focused on their preparations, on the platform and ropes and symbolic violence. The rustling came again, closer now, but still barely audible. Clara didn't know what it meant, couldn't see what moved in those shadows, but something was coming. Isaiah moved through the trees like smoke. His shoulder burned with each careful step, but the pain sharpened his focus rather than dulling it. He'd positioned himself east of the camp, downwind, where the morning shadows pooled deepest. 2 guards stood watch at the perimeter. Young men, rifles held loosely, attention divided between the preparations in the yard and idle conversation. They hadn't been trained for this work. Their positioning was poor, leaving blind angles. Their weapons were held for show rather than readiness. Isaiah approached the first from behind, moving during moments when branches dripped loudest. He calculated the man's height, the angle of his neck, the precise pressure needed. When he struck, the guard went down without a sound, unconscious but breathing, pulse steady beneath Isaiah's checking fingers. He dragged the body into dense underbrush and secured him with wire, tight enough to hold but not tight enough to damage. The man would wake with a headache and bruises, nothing more. The second guard heard something and turned, rifle rising. But Isaiah was already moving, closing the distance before the man could process the threat. Another precise strike. Another unconscious body hidden carefully away. Isaiah paused, listening to the camp. No alarm raised. No indication his presence had been detected. He moved to the torch rack, a crude wooden frame holding 6 burning brands that lit the yard. The clan had positioned it centrally, probably for dramatic effect. They wanted light for their spectacle, wanted Clara and Amos to see the faces of their executioners. Isaiah studied the structure briefly, then withdrew the small pouch of black powder from his pack. He'd saved it for years, never quite sure why. Now he understood. He spread the powder carefully around the base of the torch rack, working quickly but precisely. Then he withdrew slightly, positioning himself where he could see both the rack and the livestock pen where Clara was held. She was watching the tree line. He could see her face turn toward the shadows where he'd moved. Something in her posture suggested she sensed him there, even if she couldn't see him clearly. Isaiah struck flint to steel. The spark caught. The powder ignited with a sharp crack and sudden flash of light. The torch rack exploded in a shower of burning wood and ember. Men shouted in confusion as darkness dropped over half the yard. Flames scattered across the ground, creating chaos and broken light. Isaiah moved immediately, no longer needing stealth. He struck the nearest hooded figure from behind, a hard blow to the kidney that dropped the man gasping. Another tried to raise a rifle, but Isaiah swept his legs and disarmed him before he hit the ground. The clan members scattered in confusion, some running toward the disturbance, others retreating from it. Their lack of training showed immediately. They bumped into each other, shouted contradictory orders, wasted precious seconds trying to understand what was happening. Isaiah targeted the organized ones first, the men who tried to form defensive positions or coordinate responses. He moved through them with brutal efficiency, using their own momentum against them, striking nerve clusters and joints that would incapacitate without killing. A large man rushed him with a knife. Isaiah sidestepped and drove his elbow into the man's temple. The attacker collapsed in a heap. Two more came together, trying to flank him. Isaiah threw dirt in one's face and kicked the other's knee sideways. Both went down, screaming. He felt the old combat rhythm taking over. Assess, move, strike, assess again. His wounded shoulder protested each impact but held. His breathing stayed controlled despite the exertion. Near the farmhouse, he spotted Mr. Barrow shouting orders, trying to rally his scattered cell. Isaiah marked him but didn't approach yet. Clara needed to be freed first. At the livestock pen, Clara had already acted. A fallen axe from the scattered equipment lay within her reach. She grabbed it and swung hard at the chain holding Amos, the blade biting into weakened links. The third blow broke it. "Go," she told Amos. "Run for the trees." But Amos stayed, helping her stand, supporting her weight as they moved away from the pen. Isaiah appeared through the smoke, and Clara's eyes found him immediately. The relief that crossed her face nearly broke his composure. "Isaiah!" she breathed. He checked her quickly for serious injuries, then turned to Amos. "Can you walk?" "I think so," Amos said, though he leaned heavily on Clara. "Then help her get the others free." Isaiah pointed to where several black men and women were chained near the barn, other captives he'd seen during his earlier infiltration. "Get them to the creek bed and follow it north. Don't stop until you reach the federal garrison." Clara nodded. She understood. "What about you?" "I'm finishing this," Isaiah said. He moved back into the chaos before she could argue. More clan members were fleeing now, abandoning their hoods, running for horses tied beyond the farmhouse. Isaiah let them go. They were followers, confused men who'd been manipulated. The real threat was their leader. Mr. Barrow had reached the barn and was mounting a horse. Isaiah sprinted across the yard, ignoring the pain that flared through his injuries. He reached the barn just as Barrow kicked the horse into motion. Isaiah grabbed the reins and yanked hard. The horse reared and Barrow tumbled backward, hitting the ground heavily. Before he could rise, Isaiah had him pinned, knife against his throat. Barrow's hood had fallen away, revealing a red face twisted with fear and rage. "You're making a mistake," he gasped. "I have connections, influence. You kill me, and—" "I'm not going to kill you," Isaiah said quietly. The words surprised him as much as they did Barrow. "You're going to stand trial, going to answer for what you've done in front of federal authorities. They'll never convict me. Isaiah pressed the knife just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "You'll confess. You'll name everyone involved. And you'll pray, 'The law protects you from what these people would do if I let them have justice their own way.'" He pulled Barrow to his feet and bound his hands tightly with wire. Around them, the camp had emptied. The remaining clan members had fled into the forest, leaving their hoods and weapons scattered across the muddy ground. Smoke drifted from the destroyed torch rack. The livestock pen stood open and empty. Clara emerged from the barn with 5 freed captives, Amos supporting an elderly man who could barely walk. She'd found blankets somewhere and wrapped them around the women's shoulders. When she saw Isaiah with Barrow bound and controlled, she nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. The sky was brightening now, true dawn replacing the gray half-light. The rain had stopped completely. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Isaiah walked Barrow over to where Clara stood. She looked at the man who'd orchestrated her kidnapping, who'd planned to burn her community, who'd tried to use terror to crush their hope. "You failed," she told him simply. Barrow said nothing, staring at the ground. Amos collapsed against the barn wall, shaking with relief and exhaustion. The elderly captive sat beside him, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. Isaiah and Clara embraced beside the extinguished torches, holding each other tightly. He felt her heart beat against his chest, strong and steady. Alive. "We need to gather evidence," Isaiah said after a moment. "Documents, names, everything that ties this cell to larger organizations." Clara nodded against his shoulder. "The farmhouse. I heard them mention papers in the office." Together, they began searching the camp. Later that morning, the federal garrison occupied what had been a Confederate supply depot before the war. Now Union soldiers patrolled its perimeter, their blue uniforms stark against the red clay and weathered wood. Isaiah approached the main gate, carrying a leather satchel, heavy with evidence. The guards studied him with suspicion. A black man arriving at dawn, muddy and blood-stained, asking to see the commanding officer. "State your business," the guard said. "I have information about terrorist activity planned against freedmen's settlements," Isaiah replied. His voice was calm, measured. "Documents? Confessions? Names of organizers?" The guard's expression shifted slightly. "Wait here." He disappeared inside. Isaiah stood in the morning sun, feeling exhaustion settling into his bones now that the immediate danger had passed. His wounded shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. The cuts on his hands had stopped bleeding, but remained raw and painful. Minutes passed. Then the guard returned with a captain, a thin man with sharp eyes who looked Isaiah up and down carefully. "I'm Captain Hendricks," he said. "You have evidence of terrorist planning?" Isaiah opened the satchel and withdrew the first document, a ledger listing clan cell members, their occupations, and their assigned targets. This was taken from Mr. Edmund Barrow's farmhouse this morning. He organized a kidnapping and planned coordinated attacks on 3 black settlements for tonight. Hendricks took the ledger, scanning the pages. His jaw tightened. Where is Barrow now? Bound and guarded at his farm, along with several captured cell members. I have a witness willing to testify. A young white man who was coerced into joining, but chose to help the kidnapping victim instead. The captain looked up sharply. You captured them yourself? I protected my community, Isaiah said carefully. The same way I served during the war. Something in his tone made Hendricks pause. Recognition flickered across his face. You were Union military? Specialized operations, Isaiah confirmed. Working behind Confederate lines. The records are sealed, but Major General Thomas can verify if needed. Hendricks studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Come inside. Bring everything you have. The garrison office smelled of lamp oil and tobacco. Isaiah spread documents across the captain's desk. Maps marking planned attack routes. Correspondence between Barrow and sympathizers in neighboring counties. financial records showing who funded weapons purchases, membership rolls with over 40 names. "This is extensive," Hendricks said, sorting through papers. "How did you gather this so quickly?" The cell was disorganized, overconfident. They documented everything because they believed themselves untouchable. Isaiah paused. They were wrong. A sergeant entered with Amos, who looked terrified but determined. The young man's face was bruised from the beating he'd received, and he walked with a pronounced limp. "This is Amos Whitfield," Isaiah said. "He can identify cell members and describe their activities firsthand." Hendricks gestured to a chair. "Sit down, son. Tell me what you know." Amos sat carefully, hands trembling. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I joined 3 months ago. My cousin brought me to a meeting, said it was about protecting our way of life." He swallowed hard. "They lied. It was about terrorizing good people who never did nothing wrong." "Go on," Hendricks encouraged. "Mr. Barrow recruited most of us. Said colored folk were getting too bold after the war. Said we needed to remind them of their place." Amos's voice dropped. "But when they took Clara Tompkins, the midwife who saved my sister's life, I couldn't be part of that." "What exactly did Barrow tell you about the planned attacks?" Amos detailed the plan methodically. 3 settlements targeted, coordinated timing, instructions to burn homes and churches, orders to leave survivors terrified enough to flee the county entirely. Hendricks took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Amos finished, the captain leaned back in his chair. "This testimony, combined with the documentary evidence, gives us grounds for immediate arrests." He looked at Isaiah. "You understand you'll need to testify as well?" "I understand," Isaiah said. "But my wife was the primary victim. Her testimony will carry more weight than mine." "We'll need both," Hendricks said firmly. "And we'll need protective custody for this young man until the trials conclude." Amos nodded, looking relieved rather than frightened. "I'll tell the truth. All of it. Even if it means admitting what I almost did." The captain called for additional soldiers. Within minutes, a detachment was preparing to ride to Barrow's farm. Isaiah provided detailed directions and descriptions of who they'd find there. "How many are still at the location?" Hendricks asked. 5 captured and restrained. Barrow is the priority. He organized everything. The others are followers, scared men who made terrible choices. "They'll all face charges," Hendricks said, "but cooperation will be noted in their favor." Isaiah stood to leave, then hesitated. "There are 43 names in that ledger. Some are prominent citizens, men with influence." "I'm aware of the difficulties," Hendricks replied, "but federal authority supersedes local politics. These arrests will happen, regardless of who object." For the first time that morning, Isaiah felt something like hope. Clara arrived home to find neighbors gathered outside her cabin. Women rushed forward, embracing her carefully, checking her injuries with gentle hands. Men stood back respectfully, but their relief was obvious in their faces. "We thought the worst," Mrs. Patterson said, tears streaming down her weathered face. When Isaiah left with that look in his eyes, we knew something terrible had happened. "I'm here," Clara said simply. "I'm safe." The elderly Mr. Freeman stepped forward. "Your husband, he saved more than just you last night. He saved all of us from what they had planned." Clara nodded, suddenly exhausted. The women sensed it and began shooing everyone away, promising to return later with food and help. Inside the cabin, Clara washed her face and hands, wincing at the rope burns on her wrists. She changed into clean clothes and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. When Isaiah returned an hour later, she stood and went to him. "I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day."